A Web of Obsidian. The Obsidian Sisterhood. Book 1. By Lydia M. Hawke. Narrated by San Annis. Chapter 1. Well, fuck, I muttered. I stared at the neatly penciled columns of figures in the accounts book spread before me, my gaze resting on the last number in the last column of the last row. The very negative number. Then it lifted to the stack of envelopes, sitting unopened by the desk lamp, the top one stamped with a bright red overdue. Then, because there didn't seem to be a better word for the kind of trouble the Mary Magdalene House for Women was in right now, I said it again. Fuck, fuck, fuck. Resting my elbows on the desk, I pinched the bridge of my nose beneath my glasses. I squeezed my eyes shut against the images my brain had insisted on conjuring all morning, because the accounts themselves weren't stressful enough. Images of what would happen to the shelter's residents if we had to close. Small, vulnerable Phoenix, with her spiky blonde hair and brand new lip piercing, back on the street without access to her hormone therapy. Tall, stoic Therese, returning to the man responsible for her horrific scars, and to almost certain death. Purple-haired Danelle, turning tricks by night and carving her self-hatred into her skin by day. Gruff Alice, descending back into the drugs she'd fought so hard to leave behind. My eyes shot open, because closed they were just making my imaginings more vivid, and I stared again at the ledger. The numbers sat on the page, unflinching, unchanging, uncaring. I swore at them, too. Bloody fucking hell, I growled. A corner of my mind winced at the language that was, at least in part, to blame for my having been thrown out of the convent and the church I had once vowed to serve, more than 20 years before. But a greater part of me didn't, give a fuck, to be frank, because, to my mind, my service had always been to a far greater power than an institution. Especially a backward, man-made institution that had vetoed the idea of opening a shelter like the Mary Magdalene because it frowned upon the women I wanted to care for. Because, fuck that, too. I winced again. My language had become a little over the top these days, even for me. I really should try to curtail it, if only for Sister Ernestine's sake. Her own tended toward the salty side, but she wasn't as likely as I was to slip up in front of the bishop. And while I might not officially be a nun anymore, watching my tongue seemed the least I could do, as a boarder of the Sisters of St. Mary. Especially when they had folded me into their little family with such open-hearted welcome. And when it had been Sister Ernestine herself who had assured me at my boarder suitability interview that, regardless of what the church might think, I was still, and always would be, a nun. As far as I can tell, Sister Monica, she'd said, standing up from behind her desk and stretching her hand across to shake mine, your vows are intact, at least the ones that matter in this house. For all of that and more, it behooved me to at least try to clean up my language a little bit. But maybe I'd wait until after this particular crisis was over, because, fuck, I growled again, as I returned to thinking about said crisis. I slanted a look at the portrait of the shelter's namesake, hanging on the opposite wall, where it covered a hole in the plaster that had needed repair for as long as I could remember. Mary Magdalene gazed back, her expression implacable, and not at all helpful. I scowled at her, then leaned back in my chair and stared at the stained ceiling, also in need of repair. The shelter had never been profitable, that wasn't its purpose, but neither it had been quite this far in the hole before, with so few prospects for digging itself out. It was barely the end of summer, with more months than I cared to count before year-end, when the annual donations turned over again. I'd already exhausted every ounce of goodwill my connections were willing to extend to one small shelter in the vast city of Toronto. I threw the pencil I'd been using onto the desk and watched it skate across and drop off the other side. Scratch the few prospects idea. I had no prospects at all. I met Mary Magdalene's serene gaze again. You could do something other than just watch, you know, I told our patron sourly. Then I sighed. I'm sorry. I know you do your best, and I am grateful. But we really could use your help right now, my friend. A way to cut back. A way to bring in more... something. Anything? There was no response, of course. There never was. And I would be the first to run for help if I ever did receive an answer. I wholly believed in the power I served, and the saint who watched over us. But I was far too much of a realist to think either would actually speak to me. Or to anyone, for that matter. Pope included. Which had been another reason for my departure from the church. Ask me if I cared about that, either. I pressed my lips together and returned my thoughts to the overwhelming problem at hand, and my waning hope that I could keep the shelter afloat, or my momentum going. At the ripe old age of 69 and counting, I was all too aware that my work in the neighborhood wasn't getting any easier. That didn't, however, make it any less needed. The clank of dishes and a muffled burst of laughter reached me through the swinging door that separated the kitchen from my office, formerly a butler's pantry, in the shelter's days as a much grander house. Despite the certain financial doom looming over us, I smiled. Lunchtime, I thought, glancing at the digital clock sitting on the corner of my desk. Tanya, self-appointed chief cook, had promised gazpacho today, because it was too hot to cook in the unair-conditioned house. It would be the 4th time the residents all sat down together at the battered harvest table they'd lugged home last week from an alley 3 blocks away. And yes, I was still counting, because each of the occasions was worth marking. The thing was massive. It had taken their combined strength and strategy to maneuver it up the back steps and into the kitchen, and another team effort to clean it of decades of grunge. But it had been worth the struggle. For the first time in the shelter's 20-year history, all of its residents had eaten at the same table at the same time, further cementing the bonds that had drawn them together. Ties stronger by far than family ones, even though the faces had changed so many times over the years. I pushed back from the desk, my gaze going one last time to the accounts book and its negative balance as I stood. Some days, I couldn't help but think how things might have been different if I'd found a way to stay within the church, if I'd requested a transfer away from St. Paul's Monastery to another, more accepting convent, if I'd been compliant enough to remain part of the fold. Then, perhaps, I might have at least been able to ask for an emergency loan. My mouth twisted. Except all of this, the shelter, our independence, the women who gathered together for lunch in the kitchen beyond, only existed because I had broken away. Because I'd already spent 25 years thinking I could change things from within the institution, and I had achieved exactly nothing. Because I'd been so bitter and disillusioned and angry that I could see only one way out for myself. And Mother Annunziata and Archbishop Grant had agreed, and sped me on my way. Because, when it came down to it, I could not remain part of a system that turned its back on the diversity that was simple human nature, genetics, science, just as my father had turned his back on one of his own. I slammed the ledger shut, and my gaze went to the words I'd had tattooed on the back of my left hand, in celebration of opening the shelter. No regrets, it reminded me, and I squared my shoulders and lifted my chin. It didn't matter if I was 69 or 109. As long as I had breath left in my body, I would find a way to keep the shelter going, and to ensure that its residents were safe and fed, and... A shriek pierced the air, and I forgot about breathing altogether as my head snapped up and my gaze locked on the door. That had sounded like... The shriek came again, and I bolted for the kitchen. Chapter 2. A half-dozen wide-eyed gazes locked onto me as I burst through the door. Before I could even begin a head count, spiky-haired Phoenix pointed toward the door leading to the hallway and the front of the house. "It's Cindy," she said. "She went to get the—" Another screech cut her off. With my entire flock on my heels, I ran from the kitchen. Cindy Blackwater stood in the front doorway, filling her lungs for another go at yelling when I reached her. The young woman jumped when I put a hand on her shoulder, and huge dark eyes looked up, filled with horror. She launched herself into my arms. She's dead, she's dead, she's